He thought the horse he bought was worthless. It stood silent, avoided every glance, and seemed only another mistake on a farm already drowning in debt. But on a night of smoke, fire, and broken pride, that horse revealed a secret no one could ignore. This is not just a story of survival. It's about trust, redemption, and the moment when an animal chose to save a family and to stay. The auction barn still smelled of dust, hay, and old sweat when Evan Whitlow led the horse out. A late summer sun hung low, throwing long shadows across the gravel lot as the sound of the auctioneer's gavel faded behind him. The animal walked stiffly, head low, ears tilted back, as if retreating from a world too loud. Its coat was the color of dark chestnut, dulled by neglect, and a thin white star rested on its forehead like a drop of paint spilled by accident. Evan tightened his grip on the lead rope. He knew June would be furious when he hauled this investment into their already failing farm. The bank notices piled on the kitchen counter had been warning enough. Yet something in the horse's eyes, something that looked almost like a question, had made him lift his hand during the auction and offer the lowest bid. It wasn't reason, not sense, and certainly not money. It was impulse, and impulse was a luxury he thought he had buried long ago. The truck ride home rattled with silence. The trailer clanked behind, and the horse shifted its weight uneasily, hooves scraping metal. Evan's jaw worked, the taste of dust thick in his throat. Out the window, the eastern Oregon hills lay dry and brittle, their grasses faded to a weary gold. Once, these fields had promised prosperity. Now they only mirrored his exhaustion. When he pulled into the yard, June stepped out of the house, her scrubs still on from the night shift at the county hospital. Her hair clung damp with sweat to her temples. She froze when she saw the trailer, arms folded tightly across her chest. "You didn't," she said flatly. Evan climbed down, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't meet her eyes. "It was cheap," he muttered. "Cheap?" June's laugh was sharp, dry as kindling. "Evan, we can't even keep up with the water pump. And you bring home another mouth to feed?" Maya, their 13-year-old daughter, slipped out from behind her mother. She carried her camera strung across her shoulder, the strap fraying. Her gaze was curious, not judgmental. She leaned forward as Evan opened the trailer. The horse stepped down cautiously, each hoof touching the ground like testing thin ice. Its body was strong but gaunt, flanks drawn in, tail tangled. Maya raised the camera, clicked once, but the horse turned its head sharply away, leaving only the outline of a mane in her frame. Caleb, 8 years old, bounced at the edge of the scene, trying to push past his sister. "Can I ride it, Dad?" "No," Evan said too quickly, more sharply than he intended. The boy fell, back. Lips pressed tight, and the air between them thinned. The horse flicked its ears. A metal clang rang out from the shed, a loose hinge striking the wall in the breeze. Instantly the animal jerked, eyes wide, muscles coiling as though to flee. Evan caught the rope short, feeling the surge of power at the other end. He muttered under his breath, "Skittish." June shook her head, already turning back toward the house. "We can't afford useless, Evan. We can't." Her voice carried the weight of sleepless nights and unspoken arguments. Dinner that evening was silent. The only sound was the wind pressing against the old windows, carrying with it the smell of dust and dry earth. The radio on the counter repeated the forecast. Continued drought, high fire risk, low water tables. Evan ate without tasting, eyes drifting to the dark window where he could just make out the silhouette of the horse in the paddock. Its head was bowed, but its ears were alert, as if listening for something no one else could hear. When he finally laid down in bed, June already asleep beside him, Evan stared into the ceiling shadows. His father's voice rose from memory, gruff and unforgiving. "A man's worth is what he can make grow." Evan swallowed hard, turning onto his side. He told himself he'd sell the horse if it didn't prove useful soon. Outside, under the indifferent stars, the nameless horse shifted its weight, nostrils flaring against the dry night air. Somewhere in its silent chest, memories stirred. Of smoke, of sudden alarms, of a life lived in service long before this farm. But for now, it stood still, tethered between past and present, waiting for someone to see what it really carried inside. The morning came without color. A pale sky stretched over the eastern Oregon hills, offering no promise of rain. Evan rose before dawn, as he always did, but the air inside the farmhouse felt heavy, like a quilt soaked with silence. June had left early for her shift at the county hospital, her coffee mug still half full on the counter. The kids sat at the table, each orbiting their own small world. Maya sketching in her notebook, Caleb balancing a spoon on his nose. Evan chewed toast without appetite, his mind already circling the weight of numbers and debts. Outside, the horse stood at the edge of the paddock, motionless. Its dark coat glistened faintly in the morning haze, but its eyes remained distant, unreadable. Evan avoided looking too long. The purchase gnawed at him like a splinter under skin. Every moment that harbor, or whatever name the children would eventually give it, did not prove its worth felt like a louder accusation against him. He pulled on his boots and went to check the pump. The old machinery groaned as he cranked it, coughing up water in irregular spurts. Rust clung to the spigot, orange stains spreading like bruises along the concrete trough. The flow weakened, then stopped altogether. Evan swore softly under his breath, not at the pump, but at himself, at the string of choices that seemed to tighten around his family like a noose. From the barn doorway, Maya's voice carried timidly. "Dad, do you think she's hungry?" She pointed at the horse, her camera dangling from her neck. "She'll eat when she eats," Evan said, sharper than he intended. Maya flinched, then pressed her lips shut, slipping back inside. He hated the way his tone cut her down, but he was powerless to reel it back. Later that day, the mail truck rattled down the gravel road, leaving a dust trail behind. Caleb ran to fetch the bundle, barefoot, his laughter ringing across the yard. But the laughter died as soon as Evan unfolded the letter stamped with the bank's logo. A final notice. Payment overdue. Foreclosure procedures imminent. That evening, June arrived home, exhaustion draped over her shoulders like a second uniform. She dropped her bag by the door and rubbed her temples. Evan handed her the letter without a word. She scanned it, then folded it neatly, as though tidiness could soften the blow. "We'll figure something out," she whispered. But her voice lacked conviction. At dinner, the silence deepened. Caleb pushed peas around his plate. Maya slipped away early with her camera. Evan stared at the table, at the grooves carved by years of use, and wondered how many more dinners they had left in this house. From the window, he could see the horse again, shifting uneasily as the wind rattled the shed's loose hinge. The clanging sound echoed through the yard, metal against wood, and the animal's body tensed. Evan clenched his fork, jaw tight. Another mouth to feed, another reminder of his reckless choice. After the children had gone to bed, June lingered at the sink. She washed the dishes slowly, as though each plate required her full concentration. Finally, she spoke without turning. "I know why you bought it," she said quietly. "You saw something you can't explain." "But Evan, explanations don't pay the mortgage." He said nothing. The clock ticked on the wall, each second heavier than the last. When he finally stepped outside to lock the barn, the air smelled faintly of sage and dust. The horse raised its head as he approached, its eyes glinting in the moonlight. For a brief moment, Evan felt the gaze pierce him, steady and searching, as though the animal was reading something he could not hide. He turned away quickly, pulling the barn door shut. Lying awake later, Evan traced cracks in the ceiling plaster with his eyes. The fracture lines reminded him of the fissures growing inside his own family. Thin at first, but spreading. Inevitable. He rolled onto his side, trying not to listen to the hollow silence between himself and June. Somewhere outside, the horse shifted again, hooves pressing into dry soil, carrying its secrets silently into the night. The day dragged heavy, like the air itself carried weight. By late afternoon, the sun dipped behind a haze of smoke drifting from distant wildfires, painting the sky a muted orange. Evan worked on patching the roof of the old equipment shed, his hammer striking a dull rhythm against warped wood. Sweat rolled down his neck, stinging his eyes, and each blow seemed to echo the pounding inside his chest. When he finally came in for supper, the house felt uneasy. June stirred a pot of soup, her movements stiff with fatigue. Maya sat with her camera on her lap, staring at the horse outside through the window, while Caleb hummed under his breath, building towers of peas on his plate. No one spoke much. The weight of the foreclosure notice still hung in the air, unmentioned, but undeniable. That night, after the children were tucked in, Evan stepped outside. The yard lay quiet beneath a starless sky, the kind of darkness that presses down like a blanket. Crickets sang faintly in the weeds. From the barn came the low shuffle of hooves, steady and restless. He locked the doors, checked the water trough, and returned inside, telling himself he had done all he could for one day. Near midnight, the storm began. Not rain, just wind. It came in hard gusts, rattling the loose metal hinge on the shed, slamming it against the boards with a metallic clang. The house creaked in protest, windows shivering in their frames. Evan stirred awake, heart thumping, as the sound of frantic pounding filled the night. For a disoriented second, he thought it was the wind shaking the shutters, until he heard the unmistakable cry of a horse. He stumbled into his boots and yanked open the door. The air outside bit cold and dry, tinged with a sharp, unfamiliar odor. At the barn, Harbor was in a frenzy. The chestnut gelding reared against the stall door, hooves striking wood with desperate force. His eyes rolled white, ears pinned flat, muscles taut as a drawn bow. He let out another piercing whinny, slamming his chest against the boards. "Easy!" Evan shouted, rushing forward. He grabbed the latch, fumbling to steady the animal. Harbor shoved against him, nostrils flaring wide. That sharp scent struck Evan's nose again. Chemical, dangerous, a ghost of something he'd smelled once before near a leaking propane heater. His pulse spiked. He darted past the horse toward the corner of the barn. The small propane tank used for heating and lamps hissed faintly, the valve loosened in the shaking wind. The smell was unmistakable now, gas filling the enclosed space. One spark, one lantern, and the barn would be an inferno. With shaking hands, Evan twisted the valve shut. The hiss died, silence rushing back in. He leaned against the wall, chest heaving, sweat chilling on his skin despite the night air. Harbor stood rigid behind him, still trembling, but his eyes were locked on Evan's, steady now, as though waiting for recognition. "Damn," Evan whispered. He reached a tentative hand toward the horse's muzzle. Harbor did not flinch, only blew a hot breath against his palm, the Sohin. Connection lasted a heartbeat before Evan pulled away, unsettled. By the time he returned to the house, June stood in the doorway, robe wrapped tight, worry carved into her features. "What happened?" "Gas leak," Evan muttered. "Barn could have gone up." "And the horse?" she asked. Evan hesitated. "He made a racket, woke me up." He left it at that, unwilling to admit more, even to himself. They walked back inside, careful not to wake the children. Evan sat on the edge of the bed long after June had returned to sleep. His father's voice echoed in his skull again. "A man earns his keep through what he can prove, not what he imagines." He shook his head, trying to dispel the thought. Yet he couldn't shake the image of Harbor's eyes in the dark, how the animal had seemed to know, to sense the danger before anyone else. That memory lingered, pulsing quietly in his chest as he lay staring into the blackness. Outside, the wind eased. Harbor shifted in his stall, breathing steady now, ears flicking at the calm. For a moment, the yard was utterly silent, as if holding its breath around a secret only the horse understood. Morning came soft, muted by thin clouds drifting low over the hills. The house smelled faintly of coffee and damp hay. After the night's fright with the gas, Evan moved through the kitchen with a stiffness in his shoulders, as though the memory clung to him like smoke. June had already left for another shift, her absence a hollow note in the rhythm of the household. Maya lingered by the window, her camera slung across her neck. She had barely slept. The image of Harbor slamming against the stall door replayed in her mind, not frightening but compelling, like a message she couldn't quite decipher. She wanted to capture that intensity, to prove it wasn't just luck that the horse had raised the alarm. When Evan stepped out to check the pump, Maya followed with quiet determination. The horse stood at the far side of the paddock, head lifted toward the ridge where the wind carried the scent of distant pine. Its dark coat gleamed with dew, and the white star on its forehead caught the dim light like a single ember, refusing to die. Maya raised the camera, steadying her breath. She clicked once, the shutter breaking the silence. But Harbor turned away sharply, mane falling across his face, leaving only the blurred edge of his neck in the frame. She frowned, tried again, circling slowly to find the right angle. Every time, the horse shifted, avoiding her gaze as though refusing to be seen fully. Frustration burned her cheeks. "Why won't you let me?" she whispered. From the shed, Caleb's laughter rang out. He had found a broken broomstick and was using it as a sword, slashing at invisible foes. Harbor's ears pricked instantly. His whole body went alert, nostrils flaring. He fixed his gaze on the boy, unblinking. Maya lowered her camera, unsettled. It wasn't hostility. It was attention. Every flick of Caleb's movement drew Harbor's eyes, like the horse was reading a language no one else could understand. She raised the lens again, snapping just as Harbor's ears pinned forward, his body tightening, as though anticipating something unseen. When she developed the photo later in her makeshift darkroom, a corner of the pantry strung with black cloth, the image startled her. Harbor's head filled half the frame, mane blurred in motion, but the clarity of his ears, sharp and focused toward Caleb, dominated the shot. The boy himself was out of focus in the background, a smear of energy, but the horse's intensity leapt from the paper. She carried the photo into the kitchen where Evan sat sorting through bills. He looked older in the gray light, his shoulders slumped, the bank envelope open in front of him. Maya set the photo down between the stacks of paper. "Look," she said softly. "He's watching Caleb." Evan glanced, barely more than a flicker of his eyes. "It's just a horse in a picture." He pushed the photo aside with the back of his hand, returning to the numbers. Maya swallowed her disappointment. She wanted to shout that Harbor wasn't just a horse, but the words knotted in her throat. Instead, she slipped the photograph back into her pocket. She would keep it. Proof for herself, if not for him. That evening, June returned home. She moved with weary grace, but when Maya showed her the picture, June paused. Her gaze lingered, not skeptical, not convinced, but curious. "Maybe he sees more than we do," she murmured, almost to herself. Outside, the horse shifted in the paddock, hooves pressing into the dirt. The clang of the shed's hinge echoed again in the breeze. Harbor didn't startle this time. Instead, he stood rooted, ears forward, eyes fixed on the horizon where the hills darkened into shadow. Maya raised her camera once more, framing him against the fading sky. She pressed the shutter, certain this time she had captured something true. But when she developed the shot the next morning, the horse had turned away again, leaving her with another unfinished photograph, a riddle waiting for its answer. The morning after Maya's failed photograph, the air held the sharp scent of sagebrush carried in by a restless wind. Evan was already outside, bent over the tractor's engine, sleeves rolled to his elbows. His hands worked in silence, jaw clenched, as though tightening bolts could keep the whole farm from coming apart. The low rumble of a pickup interrupted him. Dust trailed behind the old Ford as it pulled into the yard. Roy Halter climbed down, his weathered boots crunching gravel. The man carried his years like smoke, lean frame, eyes clouded but sharp when they caught the light. He nodded to Evan, adjusting the brim of his sweat-stained hat. "Morning," Roy said, voice rough as gravel. "Heard your pump's been coughing again." Evan straightened, wiping grease on his jeans. "It's holding, barely." Roy's gaze drifted past him to the paddock. Harbor stood near the fence, ears twitching, body taut against the wind. The horse lifted its head, nostrils flaring as though it recognized the old man. Roy's eyes narrowed. "Where'd you pick him up?" Evan hesitated. "Auction. Hermiston." Roy took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "That horse. I've seen eyes like that before, out in the hills, during the big fire back in '02. He paused, the silence thickening. One horse walked through the smoke, steady as if it could smell the way out. Family made it to safety behind it. I never forgot. Evan frowned, skeptical. "You're saying this is that horse?" Roy shrugged. "Could be not. But look at him. He's not just barn stock. Those eyes know more than they should." Maya, listening from the porch, clutched her camera to her chest. The words lit something in her, a confirmation of what she had been trying to capture on film. She almost ran forward to show Roy the blurred photo, but stopped, sensing her father's mood darken. Evan forced a laugh, brittle and thin. "Stories, that's all. Around here, stories don't pay bills." Roy studied him a moment longer, then shook his head. "You'd do well to listen when an animal tries to tell you something." His voice carried weight, not accusation, but warning. With that, he turned back to his truck, leaving only the low growl of the engine and a trail of dust behind. As silence settled, Harbor stamped a hoof, snorted, and returned to grazing. Evan watched, jaw tight. He hated how Roy's words stuck, like a burr you couldn't shake from your boot. That evening, June returned home with a tired smile, unaware of the morning's conversation. The children crowded around her, Caleb tugging at her hand, Maya quietly slipping the photo into her bag, hoping she might see what Evan refused to. At supper, the weight of unspoken things filled the room. Evan broke bread with unnecessary force. June rubbed her temples. Caleb chattered about school. But Maya stayed quiet, her eyes fixed on Harbor through the window, the horse's silhouette framed by the fading light. Later, when Evan stepped outside to lock up, the words of Roy Halter echoed, "You'd do well to listen." Harbor lifted his head in the dusk, gaze steady, ears pricked forward. For an instant, Evan almost believed the old man's story. Almost. Then he turned away, telling himself he had no room for superstition. But that night, lying awake, he dreamed of smoke curling low across the valley and a horse moving through it, eyes like lanterns in the dark. The week unfolded in brittle light, each day carrying the weight of drought. Dust rose with every step, clinging to skin, working its way into clothes and breath. Evan spent long hours bent over equipment, forcing machines older than himself to keep running on willpower alone. Yet no matter how many bolts he tightened or hoses he patched, he could not silence the echo of Roy Halter's words. One afternoon, June was called in early, leaving Evan alone with the children. Caleb darted in and out of the yard, his energy uncontainable, while Maya trailed quietly with her camera. Harbor grazed near the far fence, ears flicking at flies, seemingly calm. But every so often, he lifted his head to track Caleb's movements. It wasn't the casual glance of an animal aware of its surroundings. It was watchfulness, intent, a tether invisible, yet strong. Evan noticed it first when Caleb ran too far toward the ditch. Harbor froze, ears locked on him, body taut. The boy stumbled, catching his foot on a stone, and in that exact second, Harbor gave a sharp snort, pawing at the ground. The sound cut through the air like an alarm. Caleb looked back, startled, then laughed and waved. Evan told himself it was nothing more than coincidence, but the unease lodged in his chest refused to fade. Later that evening, as the sun slid low and painted the hills in copper, Caleb sat in the yard with a handful of chalk, scribbling on the porch steps. Harbor drifted closer to the fence, head lowered. Maya sat cross-legged nearby, camera ready. She watched, breath held, as the horse stretched its muzzle over the rail and pressed it gently against Caleb's wrist. The boy giggled, but Maya's heart thudded. She raised the camera, clicking just as Harbor lingered, eyes half closed, breath stirring the boy's sleeve. Within minutes, Caleb's laughter faltered. His face paled, body swaying slightly. Maya dropped the camera and shouted. Evan, inside with the bills spread around him, rushed out to find his son sagging to the ground. "Dad!" Maya cried. "The horse knew!" Evan knelt, gathering Caleb in his arms. The boy's eyelids fluttered, but his pulse beat steady beneath Evan's fingers. A faint dizziness, nothing more, yet it rattled him. He looked at Harbor, who stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on Caleb, as if waiting. When June returned later and heard the story, she pressed her hand to her mouth. "Evan, he touched Caleb before it happened?" Like he felt it coming? It was chance, Evan said firmly, though his voice cracked. He paced the kitchen, trying to bury the memory. Kids faint sometimes. That horse didn't predict anything. But Maya pulled the photo from her camera, still raw and grainy. In the picture, Harbor's muzzle rested against Caleb's wrist, the boy's chalk scattered like fallen petals. There was no mistaking the intent in the horse's posture, the steadiness in his eyes. June studied the image, her brow furrowed. She didn't argue with Evan, but she didn't dismiss it either. Instead, she placed the photo gently on the counter beside the unpaid bills. Two truths sat side by side, demanding attention. That night, as the children slept, Evan lay awake, listening to the wind scrape against the windows. He closed his eyes and tried to believe in logic, in facts, in numbers. But behind his eyelids, he saw Harbor's head bent to Caleb's wrist, saw his son collapse moments later. The pattern was too sharp to ignore. Out in the paddock, Harbor stood beneath the stars, his body outlined in silver light. He breathed slow and deep, ears twitching, as though attuned to a frequency no one else could hear. A hidden sign had been given, and though Evan fought it, the truth pressed closer with every beat of the horse's steady heart. The morning after Caleb's fainting spell, the house felt fragile, like a glass that might crack under the smallest touch. June moved quietly through the kitchen, brewing coffee before her next shift, her eyes soft with worry. Maya hovered near the table, the photograph of Harbor pressed to her chest, unwilling to let it out of sight. Evan sat across from them, staring into his mug as if answers might rise with the steam. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the horse lowering its head to Caleb's wrist, followed by the boy's collapse. June broke the silence first. "We can't ignore it anymore, Evan." He knew. Evan shook his head, jaw clenched. "I won't build my life on coincidences." "Then build it on learning," June said gently. "If there's even a chance this horse is different, we owe it to ourselves to understand. We can't keep pretending it's nothing." Later that day, Diego Morales pulled his old Chevy into the yard. The farrier had been working with horses all his life, a man whose presence carried the calm of someone who listened more than he spoke. He crouched by Harbor's hooves, trimming and shaping with practiced hands. Evan leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching. "This one's not like most," Diego said finally, nodding toward the gelding. "He's alert in ways I don't often see. Doesn't just react, he reads. You should learn to read him back." Evan frowned. "And how do you do that?" "Patience," Diego replied. "Start with the ears. They're his compass. Forward means interest. Pinned means fear or anger. Sideways, he's listening. The tail, too, like a clock hand ticking between calm and storm. You don't control him. You listen." Maya listened intently, her camera forgotten at her side. She watched as Diego ran his hand down Harbor's flank, then stepped back. The horse exhaled, shoulders loosening, as though granting permission. Over the next days, Evan tried. At first, awkwardly, he stood in the paddock, rope loose in his hand, forcing himself not to yank or command. Harbor kept distance, circling him, testing. Evan noticed the flick of ears, the shift of weight, the subtle tension in the tail. Slowly, patterns emerged. When he stepped forward too quickly, the horse tensed. When he paused and softened his shoulders, Harbor lowered his head. Maya joined him, whispering encouragement. Once, she dared to place a saddle blanket across Harbor's back. To her surprise, the horse didn't flinch. He only turned his head, one dark eye resting on her as if weighing her trust. She stroked his neck, breath catching, while Evan watched in silence. By the week's end, Evan led Harbour beyond the paddock for the first time. The dry fields stretched wide, golden under the setting sun. Dust rose around their boots and hooves. Evan kept the lead rope slack, resisting the urge to control. Harbour walked beside him, steady, ears swiveling, but body calm. At a rise in the land, Evan stopped. The horse stopped with him, unasked. For a brief moment, it felt like walking with an old friend, not a burden. He reached out, brushing his fingers along Harbour's mane. The horse did not pull away. From the porch, June watched with tired eyes but a faint smile. For the first time in months, there was no anger in Evan's shoulders. Only quiet. That night, as the sky deepened to violet, Evan stood alone by the paddock. Harbour grazed in silence, but when Evan turned to leave, the horse lifted its head and followed him along the fence line, step for step. Evan paused, a strange warmth threading through his chest. He didn't say it aloud, but in the stillness he acknowledged it. He was beginning to learn the horse's language. And maybe, just maybe, the horse was learning his. The first chill of autumn drifted across the valley, a thin veil riding the wind, but the land remained brittle and dry. The fields no longer shimmered with promise but lay weary, their grasses crushed under months of heat. Evan walked the fence line at dawn, Harbour trailing him with unhurried steps, the rope slack between them. The silence felt different now. Less burden, more company. Still, the weight of debt and failure pressed on him with every sunrise. Later that week, Roy Halter returned. His pickup rolled slow, coughing dust, the radio inside faintly carrying old country music. He climbed out with his usual stiffness, carrying a small sack of tools. "Figured your tractor might need another set of hands," he muttered. Evan didn't argue. Help, even unasked, was a currency he could no longer refuse. As they worked, Roy's gaze wandered again to Harbour grazing nearby. The horse lifted his head, ears pricked, eyes following the old man. Something passed between them, an almost recognition. Roy set his wrench down and exhaled, as if releasing a memory. "You know," he began, voice lower than usual, "back in the big fire of '02, we were cut off in the hills. Smoke thick enough to choke a man blind. Folks panicked. Couldn't see a yard in front of us." His eyes clouded, fixed not on Evan, but on the past. Then there was this horse, chestnut, star on the forehead. Walked steady through the haze, like it knew the way out. Family followed it down the ridge, out where the wind cut cleaner. Saved every one of them. Evan paused, rag in his hand. "You're saying this is the same horse?" Roy shrugged, shoulders creaking like old hinges. "Could be. Could be not. I just know eyes like that don't forget." He bent back over the engine, leaving the words to settle like ash. That night, Evan told June. She listened, folding laundry at the kitchen table, her hand stilling over a shirt. "It explains things, doesn't it? The gas, Caleb." Evan shook his head. "Stories don't make a farm solvent. Believing won't change the bank's letters." He tried to sound firm, but the cracks in his voice betrayed him. Maya, listening from the stairs, clutched her camera tight. For her, Roy's words were not a story, but a thread tying every strange moment together. She imagined the photograph she hadn't yet taken, the one where Harbour would finally look into her lens, eyes clear with truth. The following day, Evan led Harbour beyond the ridge. The air smelled faintly of charred pine carried from the distant forest. When the wind shifted, Harbor stiffened, nostrils wide, ears locked forward. His body trembled, not with fear, but recognition, as if the scent of smoke had awakened something buried. Evan felt the pull through the rope, subtle but insistent. He followed, letting Harbor guide him toward a stand of old timber scarred by fire years ago. Blackened trunks rose like monuments, their bark forever marked by flames. Harbor stopped among them, lowering his head, breathing deep. The sight stirred unease in Evan, as though stepping into someone else's memory. That evening, back at the house, he sat with June on the porch. The horizon glowed faintly with the reflection of fires burning miles away. "If Roy's right," June said softly, "then this horse has been saving lives longer than we've known." Evan didn't answer. He stared into the dark, Harbor's silhouette steady against the fading light. Part of him wanted to believe, to give in to the hope threaded through Roy's story. But another part, the part shaped by years of his father's voice, insisted that faith in stories was weakness. Yet when Harbor turned his head and met Evan's gaze across the yard, it was not weakness he saw reflected there. It was endurance, etched deep, as if the animal carried smoke and memory in its very bones. The days pressed on, each one hotter, each one drier. Even the wind carried no cool relief, only dust, scratching at the throat and eyes. Evan tried to lose himself in labor, tightening bolts on the hay baler, repairing fence posts, pushing his body until his muscles screamed. But he couldn't silence the rising tension in the household. The bank letters stacked like firewood ready to ignite. June's exhaustion grew heavier, and Maya's quiet insistence that Harbor was different lingered in the air like a song Evan refused to hear. That Saturday, June left for another double shift, the hospital desperate for nurses. "Don't overwork," she told Evan as she slipped out the door, though her eyes said she knew he would anyway. Evan grunted in reply, already gathering tools. The children followed him outside. Maya trailed with her camera, patient as always, waiting for that elusive photograph. Caleb darted into the fields, chasing grasshoppers, his laughter breaking against the wide silence of the land. Harbor grazed near the fence, but lifted his head often, ears tracking the boy's every movement. By midday, the sun was merciless. Evan wiped his brow, leaning against the tractor, when he heard Maya's scream. He turned and saw Caleb stumble, hands flailing, then crumple into the brittle grass. The world shrank to that single sight. Evan dropped everything, sprinting. "Caleb!" His voice cracked the air, fear tearing through his chest. But before he reached his son, Harbor exploded into motion. The horse whinnied sharp and urgent, pounding against the fence, eyes wild but focused on the fallen boy. Evan scooped Caleb into his arms, heart hammering. His son's face was pale, lips slack. "Stay with me," Evan begged, though the boy's eyes fluttered closed. Panic rose like fire. He pulled his phone, but the screen flashed no service. The valley was a dead zone. Harbor's cries grew frantic. The horse reared, striking the rails, then wheeled toward the gate. He kicked hard until the latch snapped loose, bursting free into the field. Evan clutched Caleb tighter, torn between fear and instinct. Harbor circled back, lowering his head, snorting, then lunged toward a dry creek bed that cut across the land. He paused, glanced back, stamping, urging. It was absurd. But in that moment, Evan understood. He threw the boy across his shoulder and followed. Harbor led, weaving through tall grass, hooves pounding a rhythm of urgency. Evan stumbled, lungs burning, but kept pace. The creek bed narrowed, revealing a faint trail leading toward Roy Halter's property. By the time Evan reached the fence line, Harbor was already there, sweating, sides heaving. Roy's cabin stood beyond, and the old man emerged, startled. "What in—" He saw Caleb limp in Evan's arms and rushed forward. Together they carried the boy inside. Roy grabbed his radio, calling for help. Minutes later, Caleb stirred. His eyes fluttered open, weak but conscious. Relief crashed over Evan, leaving him trembling. He sank into a chair, clutching his son's hand, whispering thanks he wasn't sure directed at Roy, at God, or at the horse standing outside the window. When June arrived, hours later, summoned by Roy's call, she found Evan pale and hollow-eyed. "He passed out," Evan explained, voice ragged. "I couldn't reach anyone. The horse, Harbor, he led us here." June cupped her son's face, tears shining. Then she turned to Evan. "Do you still think it's coincidence?" Evan had no answer. His throat closed around words that refused to come. He glanced out the window where Harbor stood, sweat drying along his flank, head lowered but eyes fixed steadily on the cabin. There was no pride in the animal's stance, only quiet, certainty. That night, back at the farm, Evan sat long after everyone else had gone to bed. His hands shook as he poured a glass of water, the tremor refusing to fade. He thought of his father again. A man proves himself by what he can control. But tonight, it wasn't control that saved Caleb. It was trust. Reluctant though it had been. Out in the paddock, Harbor moved slowly, each step heavy. But when Evan opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the horse lifted his head. Their eyes met across the dark, and something passed between them, something Evan could no longer deny. For the first time in years, he whispered into the silence, "Thank you." The house settled into uneasy quiet after the crisis in the field. Caleb lay tucked beneath blankets, his breathing steady, his cheeks no longer pale. June sat beside him until sleep finally carried her down, her hand resting on his chest as if anchoring him to the world. Maya slipped the photograph of Harbor into her journal, hiding it as though it contained something too fragile to show again. Evan moved through the rooms like a ghost. Relief should have filled him, but instead, a heavier weight pressed down. He saw Caleb's limp body every time he blinked. He heard Harbor's urgent whinnies echoing in his ears. Gratitude warred with guilt. His son was alive not because of him, but because of a horse he had nearly dismissed as worthless. When night came, Evan lingered at the kitchen table. The lamp threw a weak circle of light over stacks of bills and unopened envelopes. He pulled one free, his hand trembling as he unfolded it. Final demand. The bank was done waiting. He pressed his palm over his eyes, the paper crumpling in his fist. Footsteps brushed softly on the stairs. June appeared, robe wrapped tight, exhaustion etched in every line of her face. She sat opposite him without speaking. For a long while, the only sound was the clock ticking, each second heavy as stone. Finally, Evan exhaled. "I signed the papers." June lifted her head slowly. "What papers?" His throat tightened. "To sell him. Harbor. I couldn't see any other way." The words scraped raw as they left him, and his chest burned with shame. June closed her eyes, grief flickering across her features. Not surprise, not anger, but sorrow. She set her hand on the table, palm open, waiting. Evan covered it with his own, unable to meet her gaze. "I'm not my father," he whispered, voice cracking. "But I hear him every time I fail. Every time something breaks, every time money runs short. He told me a man proves his worth in what he can hold together. And I can't hold this farm. I can't hold us." The silence deepened, heavy as the night outside. June's thumb brushed over his knuckles. "You don't have to hold it all, Evan. You just have to stay." His eyes burned, tears spilling before he could stop them. He bowed his head, shoulders shaking, grief unspooling in the dark. Harbor's shadow moved, outside the window, faint against the starlight, standing still as if listening. "I don't want to sell him," Evan admitted, words muffled. "But what choice do I have? The bank doesn't care that he saved our boy. They only see numbers." June leaned across the table, pressing her forehead to his. "Then let's stop pretending we can fix this alone. We'll find another way." Evan closed his eyes, her presence steadying him. For the first time, he allowed the truth to surface, not just about Harbor, but about himself. He was scared. He was tired. And he could not carry the weight without breaking. When they finally rose to go upstairs, Evan paused at the back door. Through the glass, he could see Harbor in the paddock, standing unmoving, his gaze fixed toward the house. The horse's stillness was not emptiness, but patience, as though he had been waiting all along for this moment of surrender. Evan whispered, barely audible, "I'm sorry." The horse flicked an ear, but did not turn away. Dawn broke, restless, the sky the color of tarnished copper. Evan rose to the sound of windows rattling, the house groaning against a hard wind that swept in from the west. It carried with it a dry heat, unnatural for the season, and a bitter edge that clung in the throat. When he stepped outside, the horizon shimmered with a faint haze, not cloud but smoke carried from the Umatilla forest. Maya followed him onto the porch, clutching her camera. Her voice was small. "It's getting closer, isn't it?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The acrid scent in the air spoke louder than words. By midday, the wind had strengthened, snapping the laundry line, tearing loose shingles from the shed. Harbor paced the paddock, restless, ears swiveling, body taut as a bowstring. Caleb clung to the fence, watching the horse's agitation with wide eyes. "He doesn't like it," the boy whispered. Neither did Evan. He felt the storm before it arrived, a pressure building in his chest, the kind that meant change was already at the door. The bank's envelope lay on the counter inside, unopened. Evan had no courage left to face it. Not today. Instead, he busied himself securing what he could, hammering loose boards, tying down tarps. Every strike of the hammer echoed like a countdown. In the late afternoon, Maya ran from the field, her cheeks streaked with dust, her voice trembling. "Dad, I found something." She held out a photograph she had taken days earlier. The print showed Harbor standing on a ridge, head lifted, ears fixed toward a narrow cut through the hills. In the background, almost invisible, a faint path curved into shadow. Evan stared at the photo, his pulse quickening. It was the old trail Roy had once mentioned, abandoned since the fire years ago. Maya's eyes shone with urgency. "If the smoke comes this way, that could be the way out." Before he could answer, a sharp cry cut through the rising wind. Harbor reared, striking, at the gate, his whinny piercing. He wasn't panicked. He was warning. Evan's gut tightened. Then the first siren wailed. The county's fire alarm carried across the valley in long, mournful notes. The sound twisted through the air, ancient and terrifying. Caleb clutched his sister's arm, eyes filling with fear. June burst through the door, hair whipped wild by the gale. She had left her shift early when the hospital received the alert. "They're saying we need to be ready to evacuate," she shouted over the wind. Evan's mind reeled. Evacuation meant choice. What to save, what to leave. The house, the land, the history pressed into every board and nail. And Harbor, the horse he had promised to sell, stood at the fence, eyes blazing, ears pinned forward toward the oncoming haze. Maya clutched the photograph tighter. "Dad, he knows the way. Look at him. He knows." Evan met June's eyes. For the first time in years, there was no argument between them, only the raw truth of the moment. The wind howled, the horizon darkened, and the smell of smoke thickened until it coated every breath. He dropped the hammer from his hand. Slowly, deliberately, he walked to the paddock. Harbor snorted, pawing the ground. Ready. Evan unlatched the gate, removed the halter, and let the rope fall. The horse stepped out, free, but didn't bolt. Instead, he stood before Evan, eyes locked, waiting. "If you trust me," Evan murmured, his voice barely audible over the gale, "then I'll trust you. Show us." Harbor blew a breath, long and steady, then turned his head toward the ridge where the faint path lay hidden. The wind whipped harder, tearing dust across the yard. Behind him, Evan heard the house creak, the children calling. June's hurried steps. The fire wasn't visible yet, but the valley already felt claimed by it. The taste of ash on the tongue, the weight of dread in every heartbeat. And in that moment, Evan knew. The decision was no longer about debts or pride. It was about survival, about whether to listen to the horse that had been trying all along to speak. By late afternoon, the wind had shifted, carrying with it a thick wall of smoke that swallowed the valley in shades of gray. The horizon vanished, the sky pressed low, and ash fell like black snow across the fields. The air tasted metallic, bitter, burning the lungs with every breath. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, a chorus of warnings too far away to help them now. Evan pulled his family close near the paddock, his arm wrapped tight around Caleb, while Maya clutched her camera to her chest as if it were her heart. June's face was pale but steady, and Harbor stood before them, head high, ears locked on the ridge. "We can't stay," June said, voice hoarse from the smoke. "If the fire jumps the valley, the house won't hold." Evan nodded. For the first time in weeks, there was no hesitation, no pride arguing in his chest. He walked to Harbor, laid a hand on the horse's neck, and whispered, "Lead us." They set off across the brittle grass, Harbor at the front, Evan holding Caleb, June guiding Maya with one arm, while the girl's other hand kept snapping photographs through the haze, instinct stronger than fear. The world narrowed to a tunnel of smoke, shapes dissolving into shadow. But Harbor moved with certainty, his stride even, his ears forward as though following a compass no human could read. At times, Evan could barely see the horse through the thick air. He kept faith by the sound, hooves steady against dry earth, the rhythm like a drum calling them forward. Each breath scraped his throat raw, but he clung tighter to Caleb, matching Harbor's pace. When the smoke thickened to suffocating black, Harbor suddenly stopped. He whinnied loud and urgent, then pivoted sharply, pulling toward a narrow gully Evan had forgotten existed. They stumbled after him, sliding down the slope. The air here was clearer, the gully walls shielding them from the worst of the smoke. Evan coughed hard, chest heaving, but relief flooded him. Harbor had found them a pocket of safety. But the journey wasn't done. As they climbed the far side, a faint crackling reached their ears. Sparks rode the wind, embers glowing like cruel stars. Caleb whimpered, burying his face into Evan's shirt. June whispered steady reassurances, though her own eyes shone with fear. Then, through the smoke, Harbor froze again. He stamped the ground, ears swiveling, and bolted down a side trail. Evan followed, though doubt gnawed at him. The trail twisted deeper into the hills, away from the road he knew. But Harbor pressed on, and when they rounded a bend, they saw why. Mr. Roy's cabin stood half-shrouded in smoke. The old man collapsed against his porch, coughing violently. Harbor skidded to a halt, rearing once, calling to the humans with a desperate whinny. "Roy!" Evan shouted, laying Caleb down gently before rushing forward. He and June dragged the older man up between them, his weight heavy, lungs wheezing with every breath. "Thought I could ride it out?" Roy gasped, voice broken. "Didn't think—" "No time," June cut him off, eyes sharp. "We're getting you out." Evan turned back. Harbor stood waiting, chest heaving, his dark eyes steady. The horse stepped closer, lowering his head to Roy as if urging him on. For a fleeting moment, Evan saw it clearly. The same animal Roy had spoken of, the one that had once led a family out of smoke years ago. Now, it was their turn to follow. With Roy leaning on him, Caleb weak but clinging to June, and Maya snapping one last blurred photograph through tears, Evan gave the only command he trusted. "Go, Harbor." The horse turned, sure-footed despite the chaos, and led them up the old ridge trail. Ash swirled around them, the fire's roar now close, alive, and hungry. Yet Harbor moved without fear, carving a path through the haze. Step by step, they followed, each footfall a prayer. When at last they crested the ridge, the wind shifted. A breath of cleaner air swept over them, pushing the smoke back, revealing the faint outline of the valley below. Safe ground stretched ahead, untouched for now. Evan sank to his knees, Caleb against his chest, June clutching Roy, and Maya sobbing into her camera strap. Harbor stood tall on the ridge, chestnut coat streaked with ash, mane tangled, eyes burning bright against the dying light. He lifted his head, blowing a long, steady breath into the wind, as though marking the end of a vow. Evan looked up at him. Every ounce of doubt burned away with the fire behind them. The horse had saved them. Not by chance, not by accident, but by choice. The ridge fell away behind them, the roar of the fire dimming into distance. The air still smelled of ash, acrid and sharp, but the wind carried streaks of cleaner breath now. They had found a pocket of safety, a plateau carved by time and forgotten trails, the grass dry but untouched by flame. For the first time in hours, Evan let his knees buckle. He lowered Caleb to the ground, brushing soot from his son's cheeks with trembling hands. June collapsed beside him, her arms steadying Roy, who leaned against a boulder, coughing but alive. Maya sat cross-legged a few feet away, camera pressed against her chest. Her tears streaked pale lines through the soot on her face, but she made no sound. The silence was deep, weighted not with fear, but with the raw aftertaste of survival. Harbor stood a little apart, chestnut coat streaked with ash, side still heaving from exertion. His head was lifted, ears tuned forward, as though listening for danger that might still come. His eyes swept over them, not wild, not uncertain, but anchoring. In his stillness, they found breath. Evan felt it first, a strange calm washing through him. The panic that had knotted his chest for weeks, the debts, the fear of failure, his father's echoing judgment, loosened in that steady gaze. He reached out, resting a hand on Harbor's damp neck. The horse did not flinch. Instead, he leaned ever so slightly into the touch, a gesture so small yet so immense that Evan's throat tightened. "We made it," June whispered, her voice hoarse. She reached for Evan's hand, pressing it to her cheek for just a second before turning back to Caleb. Roy gave a low chuckle, weak but alive. "I'll be damned. Thought I was done for." His eyes drifted toward Harbor. "But he wasn't about to let me go." Maya finally lifted her camera, her fingers trembling. She raised it toward Harbor, waiting. The horse shifted, turning his head. For one suspended breath, his eyes caught hers directly through the lens. She clicked. The shutter snapped the moment into permanence. Horse and girl bound together in smoke and silence, an image she knew was different from all the others. When the sun dipped lower, the world turned strange shades of bronze and violet. The fire still glowed on the horizon. But here, in this fragile pocket, they were safe. They shared water from a single flask, passing it carefully between them, each sip precious. Evan pulled Caleb into his lap, pressing his forehead against the boy's hair. The child stirred faintly, eyes opening just enough to smile before drifting back into sleep. Maya leaned against her mother, exhaustion softening her features. Roy closed his eyes, murmuring something that sounded like prayer. And Evan, for the first time in years, allowed himself to be still. No hammer in his hands, no numbers pressing on his mind, no voice telling him he wasn't enough. Only the sound of Harbor's breathing, slow and steady, like a tide anchoring them to the earth. He looked at June, who met his eyes with quiet strength. There were no words to explain what had shifted, but both of them knew. Something had been rebuilt among the ashes, something that had nothing to do with land or bank notices. It was Harbor who anchored them now, not by saving the farm, but by showing them that survival itself could be a beginning. The horse lowered his head, cropping at the dry grass, ears flicking lazily for the first time since dawn. Evan let out a long breath and whispered, not to June, not to Roy, but to the animal who had carried them through the smoke. "You're not going anywhere." Harbor lifted his head, and in the fading light, Evan swore the horse understood. They stayed on the ridge until dawn painted the smoke-stained sky in pale streaks of pink. Exhaustion hung on all of them, but the fire had shifted east during the night, leaving their valley bruised but spared. By morning, the air smelled different, less like ash, more like earth trying to breathe again. Evan helped Roy into the back of a truck sent by the volunteer fire crew, promising to check on him once things settled. When the family returned to the farm, the house still stood, though soot streaked the siding and drifts of ash lay piled in corners like unwanted snow. The fields were battered, brittle, but intact. Evan stared at it all, his chest aching with relief and sorrow mixed together. For so long he had feared losing the farm, but now, standing with his family safe, he realized the land was not the heart of them. Days passed in a fragile rhythm. They cleaned ash from windowsills, patched fences, and shared meals with neighbors who had lost more. Packages of hay arrived from a relief fund, and even the bank sent word of a temporary hold on collections due to the disaster. It wasn't salvation, but it was time, and time was more than Evan had dared hope for. Then came the rain. It started as a whisper, a cool patter against the roof, while they sat at the dinner table. Caleb lifted his head first, eyes wide. Maya darted for the door, camera in hand. Evan followed slower, June's hand slipping into his. Together they stepped outside into the kind of miracle no one could buy. Raindrops dotted the dust, darkening it to rich soil. The air shifted, cool and sweet, carrying the scent of sage and pine awakened. Harbor stood in the paddock, head lifted high, water streaming down his dark coat. He did not move away. Instead, he turned slowly toward them, ears forward, eyes steady. Maya raised her camera. For once, Harbor didn't turn aside. The shutter clicked, capturing him framed in rain, his gaze piercing yet calm, as though he had chosen this moment to be fully seen. June laughed softly through tears, tilting her face to the sky. Caleb ran into the yard, arms flung wide, spinning until he fell in the wet grass. Evan watched, something inside him breaking and mending at once. He thought of his father's voice, that hard edge of expectation, and for the first time, it didn't echo with power. The rain drowned it out, washing the old judgments away. That evening, they hung Maya's photograph in the kitchen. It showed Harbor glistening with rain, eyes luminous, the star on his forehead shining like a beacon. Underneath it, June placed the stack of unopened bank letters. They didn't burn them, didn't throw them away, but set them aside. For now, they could wait. Evan stood a long time in front of the picture, Caleb leaning against his leg, June beside him, Maya smiling faintly at her work. He realized it wasn't just a photograph of a horse. It was proof of a turning, a season breaking open, proof that even after fire, rain could come. Outside, Harbor grazed quietly, raindrops dripping from his mane. The land drank deeply, and in the sound of water against thirsty soil, Evan heard a promise. Nothing was wasted. Not even the struggle. The valley greened slowly in the weeks after the fire. The rain had broken the long drought, coaxing shoots of grass through soil that had seemed dead. Fence posts gleamed dark with damp, and even the barn smelled different, less of dust and despair, more of earth restored. Life returned in small, quiet ways. Evan rose each morning still weighted by uncertainty, but now it was different. The fear of foreclosure remained, but it no longer owned him. The family had survived something larger than debt. They had crossed smoke and fire together, and Harbor had led them through. No letter from the bank could ever erase that. One morning, he opened the paddock gate. The sky stretched clear and endless, the ground soft beneath his boots. He stood with Harbor, resting a hand on the horse's warm flank. "You're free," he whispered, voice steady. "If you want to leave, now's the time." The gate swung wide. For a long breath, Harbor stood still, ears flicking toward the horizon where hills rolled into distance. A breeze lifted his mane, and for a moment Evan believed he would run. Back to the wild, back to memory. back to whatever past had shaped him. Maya clutched her camera but did not lift it. She held her breath, eyes wide. Caleb whispered, "Don't go." Too soft for anyone but June to hear. Then Harbor turned. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped not toward the horizon, but back to Evan. He pressed his forehead against the man's chest, a weight both grounding and tender. Evan closed his eyes, his hand sliding to the star on Harbor's brow, and let out a breath that had been trapped for years. June wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, Caleb pressed in against his side, and Maya, at last, lifted her camera. The shutter caught them all. Man, wife, children, and the horse who had chosen not to leave. That evening, Evan hung the photograph beside the one of Harbor in the rain. 2 images, one of survival, one of belonging. Together, they told a story no bank, no drought, no fire could erase. Neighbors came by with food, with seed, with laughter. Roy shuffled across the yard, leaning on a cane, alive because a chestnut gelding had turned back instead of running. He laid a hand on Harbor's neck, murmured, "Still saving lives, aren't you, old boy?" The horse flicked an ear, patient as ever. As dusk fell, Evan led Harbor to the field where green was returning. He slipped the halter free once more. This time, the gate stayed open not as a test, but as a promise. Freedom was always there. Harbor lowered his head to graze, the choice already made. He had found his place, and he would stay. Evan stood watching until the stars bled through the sky. For the first time in years, he felt no shadow of his father's voice, no weight of judgment, only the quiet certainty that he had been given not just a second chance at the farm, but at himself. And in the silence of that wide valley, anchored by love and trust, a nameless horse had found a name after all. Home. And now it's your turn. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Don't forget to subscribe, because every week we'll bring you more true-to-life stories of people and animals that will move you, heal you, and stay with you long after the video ends.